Hello and welcome to Pod of the Gaps. My name is Michael Otts. I'm joined by my normal partners in crime,
Aaron Edwards
and Andy Bannister.
And the difference today you might have picked up if you're a very sharp listener to Pod of the Gaps.
It actually sounds okay.
Hang on, did you just interrupt me without there being a technical problem?
Why would that be?
That's amazing. The amazing thing is we are actually we're gathered in person.
We're in the same place. We're not even socially distanced.
Can we do a high five so they can hear?
Yeah.
Hey.
Although a triple way high five is difficult.
Mexican wave.
A Trinity high five.
We're in Aaron's, like, is it study?
Ivory Tower.
Man cave.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, my man cave, which is
so we are here in Derbyshire.
Yes,
we are in Derbyshire. And this is very exciting also because this is the first time I've ever met Aaron in person. Yeah. I made an attempt the other week and COVID rules scuppered me.
Michael's such a renegade on COVID rules. I booked him to be a speaker for one of our evangelistic units at Cliff College. And of course, he didn't follow the rules. He didn't, in fairness, he was camping away from the internet, weren't you? So you didn't get the email saying you had to do 2 lateral flow tests.
The week before I came.
Yeah, which is a little bit over.
So the fact that I could prove that I didn't have COVID on the day that I arrived was insignificant because I couldn't prove that I didn't have COVID a week before I arrived. Yeah. That was the more important thing.
And of course, the fun thing is, of course, the reason we're recording here in Aaron's man cave is, just down the road there is Cliff College, the kind of academic centre of UK Christianity. And despite the fact, I think I'm double jabbed. You're all double jabbed, I think, aren't we?
Yeah.
I'm not.
No. Hang on a minute.
Anyway, we're all vaccinated to a degree.
We'll have to do a whole episode. Yeah.
Lateral flow. I have to, the thing is, my trouble with lateral flow, I just think it's a silly sounding name as well, actually. When I first heard it, I didn't realise it was a medical thing. I thought it sounded like a dance move. I'll do the lateral flow.
That's right.
But then I always think, isn't it? It's also a beautiful description of sort of certain types of theological position.
That's true. Certain denominations.
That
shall not be mentioned.
We did that episode a few weeks ago on how to kill a denomination. I thought lateral flow describes, someone like our friend Steve Chalk and the church in Wales and various other things.
Various other places.
Yes. Now the big irony about this today is that we are doing this in person in Aaron's ivory tower / bedroom / office because we can't go into Cliff College. But if we were a Bollywood film, we probably could get into Cliff College.
Why didn't we think of that?
Yes, because as we drove past, as we looked into Cliff College, we couldn't go into the hallowed halls, but we were able to sort of just look. You've still got around campus all these Indian signs.
We've got Hindi everywhere. You would think we'd gone so pluralistic that we've actually...
Yeah. So is that just some sort of, theological inclusivity, or is there something more serious going on?
Yeah, no, well, as I said, that they just finished filming. Well, they're supposed to have moved all their stuff out like last week, but they didn't. But some of the filming overran, and so they all of the stuff's around. It's been quite fun, actually. We've been able to have curries with them, the kind of crew.
Brilliant.
I got a chance to chat to, there's loads of Sikhs there. I got some really good evangelistic conversations with them, so I was praying for some of them, which was really nice. So there's some nice, it's been a weird, chaotic
You could
time.
tell them that Jesus specifically mentions them, right? Though, seek ye first. So they're the group you should go to first.
Exactly.
And I also love the idea, what tickled me looking at your campus today with all these sort of signs everywhere, I love the idea of new students arriving, a bit disorientated, different parts of the country, turning up and going, oh, I thought this was Cliff College, but it's actually...
It very much feels like you've turned up at an Indian school / hospital.
Yeah, so anyway. And you were telling us, like, the person who's starring in this is like some mega Bollywood. He's the Tom Cruise of India.
He is. We had the actual Tom Cruise here in this village filming a scene for Mission Impossible 7 a few weeks ago.
Right.
Yeah. And then we have the Bollywood Tom Cruise who came last week as well to film here. So, and we can now say his name is Akshay Kumar. I wasn't allowed to say that before because apparently the campus would have been mobbed knowing he was there.
So, but we'll tag him on the show notes.
Tag him on the show notes. But if you are just about to go viral and trying to get everyone to come, he's gone now.
He's
too late. Sorry, but we did feel that could have been great advertising for the college.
We could have got him on the show.
That would have been good. Anyway, good. We normally try and have a tenuous link at this point.
There's a link. We're in the school. We're in the home.
Yes. So we aren't at the established school building. We are at home because today we are thinking about homeschooling. Should Christians homeschool their children?
And that's why we're in the man cave, because my wife is with my children in the other room.
So you've got something like 75 children.
Absolutely, and counting.
Yes, and normally we try and keep the children quiet, but we did say today if they could just kind of run around outside and create a bit of ambient noise, it would kind of help.
Help the show.
Help the show. So I guess we are thinking, because when people hear about homeschooling, there's probably lots of different opinions. You both have children, and you both...
Not together, I just stressed.
There's the Methodist thing, you need to make that clear.
We are married to different people.
And they're the opposite sex, are we? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I hope so.
And you're both identifying in your gender of birth.
So many caveats these days. You can't have a conversation these days.
It takes so long. Like you say one sentence, and then there's like a whole podcast of caveats just to explain.
The funny thing is, this is a tangent, but somebody messaged me on Twitter the other day to ask about something. They were quite friendly individual, but their profile had this this massive list of pronouns. And I foolishly, without thinking, responded and went, "I'd love to see that you've named your pronouns, but for me, I think adjectives are far more important." I don't worry what pronouns people use, as long as people call me, handsome and manly and intelligent and funny and modest. And the conversation just died.
That's a great one.
Yeah, adjectives.
Name your adjectives.
Name your adjectives. Why
grumpy, inconsiderate, grouchy. Yeah.
Cancelled.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, as I was saying, Andy and Aaron do have children by other people. And
this is what happens when we're in the same room, you see.
I know, we laugh too much. Anyway, get it together. So, we have children.
We need a temporary co-host here, I think.
We do.
So,
okay. This is great for, this is why we record virtually normally. So, I think the question we're going to explore, right, is should Christians homeschool? Because homeschooling has, a mixed reputation. But, I think maybe a good place to begin would be, so our journey to homeschooling, and I know, Aaron, yours is different. Mine was just keeling off the chair. We were in Canada for 6 years before we came back to the UK. When my wife and I went there, we didn't have kids at that point. And we definitely had, if you'd said the word homeschooling, we would have had a particular image in mind. I confess it would have been very conservative. Perhaps the phrase redneck might have sprung to mind. I don't say this to say I believe that's right, but that was
frumpy skirts.
Yeah, and perhaps sort of very sort of odd kind of sort of folks,
cultish.
Lovely, but almost cultish. Then we arrived in Canada, and we met lots of friends, initially Canadians, but as I travelled across North America, met lots of families who were homeschooling who were lovely. I remember this, becoming friends with this family in Canada who had teenagers, and these teenagers were able to sit at the dinner table and engage in a very friendly way with grown-ups, and then afterwards went off and played computer games and did all the things that teenagers do, and I was like, hello. And then we had our own kids, and my wife and I, as we began to discuss what we were going to do for education, both said, well, why don't we try homeschooling? And we decided we'd give it a go for a year, and then we'd take it from there. And the first year went really well. My wife, who does most of it, was a bit nervous, but then after the first year, loved it. And since then, we've now been doing it. This is the 4th year or 5th year. Our kids are 8 and 6, and it is just phenomenal. We may talk about the practicalities of it. So we came from a position of you have got to be joking to actually we absolutely love it and have become big advocates for it. But I know your journey, Aaron's slightly different into the homeschooling.
Well, we're fresh into it, and we've been to 2.5 weeks in. So so it's all going so well.
I can hear screams from next door.
So by the time this episode actually is released in a couple of days' time, you may want to revise.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. For us, I mean, we've been talking about it tentatively for 2 or 3 years. It's always been a bit of a pipe dream. I mean, Molly's a kind of full-time homemaker, so it's an option for us to do. There was always an option, but still the challenge, exactly as you say, your wife was saying, I'm nervous about it. Molly absolutely was as well. And I think that puts a lot of people off, as well as the stigma that you mentioned, Andy, that it's weird and you're going to be off the beaten track. But eventually I've just started to realise, like why we do this podcast. The Western world is getting crazier and crazier by the day, by the minute. And those ideological problems, ciphers, are making their way into the education system. They're making their way into culture more broadly. And we're kind of just drinking it in. And if you have always thought, well, it's crazy to homeschool, I think what we've started to think, actually, I think it's far crazier to send your children for 30 hours a week for about 12 years into a system and around people who are increasingly opposed to your worldview. So there was a time, perhaps a kind of sort of the final remnants of Christendom, and there's still some of that left in our culture. There's still some elements of sort of Christian virtue and values in the West, of course. And yet, the problems we've talked about on this show a lot, those things are being eroded and almost being confused. And so it's actually really hard to be a confessional Christian in those environments. Now, I used to say, doesn't matter about that, let's be missional. So you send your children into school to be missional, to get them socialised, to make sure they're not going to be weird. You shouldn't closet them away and be fundamentalist, because otherwise, what about when they get to age 18 and you throw them in? Well, that's fine. If you're going to, that is a good argument. If you were going to do homeschooling in such a way where you made it cultish and you stopped them engaging with culture, clearly you can do it in a missional way. So you don't do that. You can socialise children. We can get onto that later on perhaps. But for us, I started to realise actually it definitely is crazier to send your kids to school. So absolutely, my argument now would be absolutely consider sending your kids to school if you're a Christian. But you have to think far more about that than homeschooling. It's much weirder to think that that's a good idea to send from the age of 5 or 4. Send your child for 30 hours a week into this missionary situation. Firstly, I doubt that most Christians are really doing that, actually seeing the mission. Secondly, like Andy said, when they get to teenagerdom, do you see most Christian children raised in Christian homes who have been educated in the school system, do you see them responding well as though that socialization has been good? Or do we get there where eventually the parents go, well, what can you do? They're kind of depressed in their room and they're addicted to social media and their peer pressures drag them away. There's a kind of dual authority between us and the teachers at school, and it's really, really difficult. But what can you do?
But wouldn't you say, though, that if you are going to do that, you're going to be kind of the abnormal one? Yeah, you're going to be the minority. Yeah, British culture anyway. Yeah. And a lot of people say, well, but actually school, that's what people do. You know, look around the world, everyone goes to school. Why would you opt out of the normal pattern and become this slightly weird fringe movement?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things to say there. I say when I hear that, I've heard that both from Christian friends and non-Christian friends. Firstly, of course, you can be a little bit cheeky and go, well, I thought we live in an age in which minorities and people who make minority decisions is actually considered a good thing.
Identify as a homeschooler.
Well, very seriously, I've had that conversation with more sort of progressive non-Christian friends and say, so, you know, turn that around and go, so therefore we should outlaw transgender because they're a small minority. People go, I wouldn't dream of doing that. Oh, well, homeschoolers were an even smaller minority. So there's that piece. But I think more seriously, I think actually what's often missed, Michael, is that actually for most of human history and in most of the cultures today, actually, it is not the norm that you send your kids to the big sort of state factory up the road and have them put through the sausage factory. I mean, certainly today, you know, schooling is more common, but a lot of those schools are quite small and much more local. And it's interesting, you know, living in a semi-rural part of Scotland, what's interesting, actually, the primary school up the road, if we chose to use that, is still that older, sort of smaller local model. But then they get sent to the big sausage factory and they go into the comprehensive thing. Actually, homeschooling has been the norm for most of civilization. So I think I always like to turn the tables and say, well, actually, I think we are actually, this is a normal model rather than what you folks are doing. But then I think the other thing that I want to say to people is, you know, it's, and Aaron, you touched on this, how do we make sure that we are intentional in our choices? Because whether you're following the majority or whether you're following the minority, I don't matter which you do, as long as you can give good reasons. So if you're following what majority do and sending your kids to, you know, into the state system, and the reason you do that is for X, Y, and Z, and you've thought that through, and you've figured it out, and you've weighed up the pros and there are cons, and there are pros and cons on both sides. Fantastic. I have nothing against parents who've done that. And equally, the same goes for homeschooling. If you're simply homeschooling because 4 of your friends at church do and you think it's cool, bad idea. If you're doing it because you've sat down and gone, this is the best thing for us and our family, and passing on the faith, great idea. So I think what matters is the reasoning behind your choices, but also the danger with the majority position. Of course, the majority position is the default, and I'm always nervous about default positions because that's the unthinking position. So whatever you do, make sure you've thought about it and don't just do it because the crowd do it.
Because ironically, in certain parts of the world, perhaps more so in North America, the default position in certain Christian communities would be to homeschool. So like you're saying, it's not a thought through, I'm going to do this because this is best for the education of my child or whatever. It's just, this is what you do. And you would be criticised for sending them to school.
And at the same time, I'd want to add the caveat that we are in a culture where the default response you'll get from Christians, and even Christian, good friends of mine, everyone, basically we're weird to most people.
You're weird to us too, I just want to reassure you.
That's right, exactly, well, we already have a weird amount of children, don't we? 75 children is slightly too many for most. But I think
we should just clarify that Aaron doesn't have 75. That's true. Taking us very literally here.
But it is I lose track. Every time I come, you seem to have a new one. So it's 5, right?
That is true. You can just assume if you haven't seen me for a year.
Another child.
There was a child placed a bit like a doorstop
in
the doorway as I arrived.
Elijah, our 10-month-old, was kind of our doorman today. Letting you guys in.
Which makes a good doorstop.
And he speaks and he greeted us in Latin. I mean, there's an argument for homeschooling.
Exactly. Yeah. But that is true.
Sorry, anyway.
No, I was going to say the thing about how you think about it, and it really, really is important. Some people might say, they'll say to me, oh yeah, we have loads of good reasons. You think, well, I think you have them in response to the fact you've heard that some people now are a little bit more it's increasingly, the stigma of homeschool is moving away, especially from COVID time where people had to do it. They thought, oh, I actually quite like doing this. And actually I get my kids back. Loads of Christian parents say over the summer holidays, towards the end of it, they're like, oh, by the end of it, I've almost gotten my children back. And they almost, and I've heard, especially from mothers, there's almost a sadness. I have to let them go again back into September. Then they get used to it and adapt and go, okay, this is kind of works and it's good for them to be socialized and all the rest of it. Again, they can be missional, but I put that in inverted commas because really, how many people do you see becoming Christians in those environments? Maybe you guys have other stories. Michael, you're an evangelist as well. I'm a real evangelist at heart. I just don't see the missional fruit that seems to be apparently so worth it that you're willing to put your children in a very vulnerable stage of their life. And it's vulnerable all the way up to age 18. It's not like just age 5. We're talking different levels of insane vulnerability. And your job as parents, a commission from God, is to bring your children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Is 30 hours a week in a completely different ideological system from the age of 5, definitely objectively the best way to do that. So the reason I put the caveat, Andy, is some people would hear what you say, go, oh, as long as you have reasons, they could find pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, you're right.
Oh, it would work for them. Absolutely, it works for you, Andy, because you've got a setup. Oh, absolutely works for you. It wouldn't work for us. So to actually think about what are the barriers that
you're right. Let me say a couple of things there, actually, and then Michael can push us on stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I can see the phones lighting up with complaints at this point. You're absolutely right. I should have caveated myself, because I think one of the reasons there's actually two of the reasons that people sometimes pragmatically choose to use the state system. One, I have to be really honest, and I do say this with compassion, but this is also going to sound harsh, so forgive me, is the lifestyle. Yeah. Because we have lots of friends locally in our community. Some are Christian, some are non-Christian, who've said things like, I wish I could homeschool, but we can't afford it. We need 2 salaries. And then you look and there are 2 Audis on the drive, there's a foreign holiday happening, there's a large house, and going, look, I appreciate you've got a nice lifestyle. And maybe if you homeschooled, you might have to cut some things a bit tighter. We've had to make some choices as a family. But you know what? We all do this. We decide how we spend our money. And if educating your children in the home is something that you've decided is hugely important, maybe that's worth paying the price for. So I think it may be economic reasons. And actually, we got a good friend of ours in Dundee who's not a Christian. She homeschools. She's an atheist. Good friend of friends of particularly my wife. Not an angry atheist at all. Finds Astrid and I fascinating. She comes from an education background. She, is trained as an educator to tertiary level. She looked at us and she said, you do realise, she said, and this is from somebody who says worked inside the system. Yeah. The system is set up to basically facilitate taxpayers. The government want 2 taxpayers in every family because you're an economic unit. Yeah. And the school is not entirely set up to educate your children. Partly it's set up to provide a babysitting service. I was like, are you serious? And she went, absolutely. I thought that was for a non-Christian. It was interesting. And the second thing I was going to say, so I think the pragmatic thing is interesting. Why do you really do it? Is it actually, it's a lifestyle choice? And then the other thing let's talk about the socialization. Actually, 2 more things very quickly. The missional thing, I totally agree with you. It occurred to me as you said that, I've got a background in Islamic studies. I have lots of friends who are in Muslim missions. You wouldn't just take a young Christian with no experience and drop them into Saudi Arabia and go do mission.
Yeah.
They would have 2-3 years of training, language training, cultural training, loads of support behind them, because it's a tough environment.
Yeah.
I think we naively assume, we still think that it's basically effectively, Christendom with a small c out there. The state system is still largely sympathetic. It isn't, it's a hostile environment. Yeah. So if we are going to send our kids in there, boy, the amount of support we need to be putting in and stuff, which I don't think maybe many of us are. And then lastly, Aaron, the socialization piece is interesting, because that's the one that's often thrown against homeschool. Well, firstly, of course, is the question, what are you socializing people into? Exactly. If you're socializing them into secularism or, sort of petty, wokiness, I'm not sure you're doing your kids any favours anyway. And then secondly, actually, our kids, I don't know about yours, are remarkably or socialise, because we put the effort in. So to go, in our case, our kids have two distinct peer groups. They've got their non-Christian friends. It's all the neighbourhood kids. And we make time for that. We encourage that. We've built friendships with neighbours. And I love the fact that, my son has got his part of this. He's 6. He's part of a little posse of all the neighbourhood boys. They call themselves the Cool Gang, which is hilarious. And so all of his best friends locally are not Christians. And they have faith discussions because they'll come back and tell me. Like, he'll say, we talked about this. It's like, oh, wow, really? And similarly for my daughter. And then they've got their non-Christian, their Christian peer group. So it hasn't held them back. So you can be a homeschooler and you can barricades up, or you could be a homeschooler and create really good friendships. And to go, basically, we haven't seen socialization be a problem. I think that is a total red herring.
A total myth. And it's a sort of a myth that actually props up conveniently the decision to not have to think about it as an option, because it's quite an inconvenient, possibly stressful thing to imagine. We're talking about someone giving up their income, possibly at least a full-time income, to be able to facilitate this, one of the parents. But again, what is the point? This is your most precious commodity.
I think on the socialisation one, it can be a problem if the intention of the parents in homeschooling is to isolate their kids from anyone who's not a Christian. And I think in some contexts that can happen. So it's like, I find the world scary, let's take them out of it. But actually, that's the problem then, is with the motive, rather than saying, I want to be able to have my child get an education so that they can engage in the wider world, but know how to respond to cultural trends.
Can I just quickly as well say, when I hear you, I don't want to be bring the kind of thought out that the world is scary. I don't want to throw my kids in, but in a way, I'm like, okay, we as Christians we're not called to have a spirit of fear, a spirit of power, love, and self-control, as Paul tells Timothy. We need to take the world on. We need to be in the world, not of the world. But there's also a sense in which there's wisdom, isn't there? And so we've almost lost the capacity to think wisely about this. And we almost assume that something like homeschooling, withdrawal of any kind, is fear. And actually, no, it can just be wisdom. It can be, say, as Andy said, would you chuck someone into an Islamic situation, say, go and do mission? And then even though that's not really happening in most children in most schools, I would say most Christians, even if there might be some listeners who say, well, my children have great conversations, it's fine. And my children did as well in the school they were part of. And I'm glad of the experience they had, the back and forth, but we realized it wasn't worth the cost. We're doing mission as a family all the time anyway. Is it actually necessary to make this really difficult tension between us and the school, and constantly have to caveat everything they're learning by talking to them? So we want to talk through these things, but there's 30 hours a week and you've got so much time. Why not actually take it into your own hands and say, right.
The other thing as well that's interesting, there are so many themes that spring off this, aren't there? The other thing I think that actually it's we're part of a couple of homeschooling networks up in Dundee. And that's another thing to say to people. I think one reason that I think many Christians I've spoken to are afraid of homeschooling is this sort of daunting sense of, I have to do it on my own. If you've got kids and you've sort of thought that, I'd encourage you, begin Googling and looking around. There will be homeschool networks locally. We have some great networks of other parents doing it, and you can support one another. Well, then the networks that we're involved in Dundee, there are non-Christian folks doing it. And what's interesting, when you ask them, okay, why are you doing it? You don't get the spiritual reason, of course. Our atheist friends who are doing it aren't all because of spirituality. But the common reason, two reasons that come up, I think are really interesting. One is the sense of, putting your child into the sausage factory. It's not a normal sociological environment to take a 7-year-old, stick them in a room with 30 other 7-year-olds and maybe 2 adults and expect kind of learning to happen. In fact, one of my family members is a primary school teacher, and she would smile at this point and say, half of teaching is crowd control. So there's actually very good, pedagogical, educational reasons. And then secondly, the thing my secular friends would say is that actually the education system, in their view, is failing to educate. And some of the issues we've talked about on this show, take perhaps the transgender piece, that is coming into schools in such a major way. My secular friends are increasingly concerned because kids are coming out now of school not educated, but taught what to think on a whole range of political issues. And it reminds me, one of the things that Christians did in history, particularly through that period of history, affectionately known as the Dark Ages, which historians would now laugh at. Again, there were no Dark Ages. But one of the things that Christians did very well were hugely involved. It wasn't just Christians, but they were hugely involved in carrying on the light of education through the time when culture was going mad. And quite frankly, we live in an age where culture is going mad. And I think as Christians, we have a duty, not just in terms of the gospel, Aaron, which you talked about, which I obviously hugely committed to, but also to be the preservers of knowledge and learning and wisdom. Because if we don't wade into that fight with other good-meaning people, and they say there are more people out there who would be alongside us on that than maybe you might think, then who on earth is going to? And that is a missional thing in itself. That's a public good that I think Christians can contribute.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying, like, there's a danger that you might be listening to this podcast and thinking, like, this is basically an apologetic just for homeschooling.
Oh, it is.
It's your job, Michael.
So now my job
is...
I've got, by the way, I've got 3 points I want to make, but you say you're pushing.
You've got 3 points.
3 points off the back of Andy's stuff. But anyway.
No, well, you go first then, because I was going to slightly change the topic.
Oh, wait, okay. Let me just jump on the back of those then.
Bear in mind, you see, Michael hasn't been homeschooled, so he doesn't, see
the benefits. I just imagine how amazing I would be if I was.
Exactly. No, but Andy's stuff about the quality of education is really, really important, and the Christian lighting the way. I thought of Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option.
I was thinking the same thing.
And this is the whole notion that Saint Benedict in the 6th century is advocating a kind of withdrawal where you've got kind of barbarian culture. The Roman Empire's fallen. There's no kind of clear infrastructure. Who's in charge of the world when you had a giant empire that falls? I like to almost say it to my students when I talk about this as though it's almost like if the internet just failed tomorrow. We're so dependent on the internet for how things work. If somehow the internet died, if that was possible, you wouldn't be able to listen to Pod of the Gaps for one thing, which would be a tragedy.
Terrible.
But what most of the ways our lives work and infrastructure works would be very different. And so the Roman Empire, when it fell, that meant that Christians had to step up. They stepped up in a way that they had to preserve things and they had to withdraw in order to bless the world better. That's what the Benedict Option is all about. So of course it can be seen as quite fundamentalist, but it's not just to hide away from the barbarians. It's preservative, conserving something in order to bless the world afresh, which clearly you see medieval Christendom, and it did do that. That's how we got Christendom, as it were, in its kind of wider implications. The second thing was going to be linking into that. One of the problems with the school system now in the woke culture is that the standards have dropped almost at an ideological level. Like it's not okay to have standards and hierarchy, because hierarchy is seen as a bad thing. We mentioned this on the Decline of Western Culture episode that Andy and I did recently with Richard Weaver's The Ideas Have Consequences. But I noticed it in the school we were in. We were in a great school, in a really nice school, and C.B. school. Isabel, our eldest, is a little creative writer, and she got a poem published a couple of years ago. And they did a kind of competition through the school this time for a short story competition. And all the parents get the kind of information of the competition. Don't worry about grammar or spelling and stuff. It's really just about creativity. We don't want to kind of batten them down with things. We just want them to be free. So what do you mean free? So I presume they're using words. I presume they're using English words, but you don't want to constrain them to have to learn the rules of grammar for how writing has been done for like generations. Okay, fine. So then they enter the competition. She's really excited to know whether she wins or not. Which stories within the class are going to be chosen for this book. And then she comes home one day and says, "Oh, amazing, Dad, there's amazing news. All of the stories got chosen." I was like, really? All of the stories of the 25 people, they just all were publishable quality. How interesting. And I got the letter through and they literally said in it, "We found it's really helpful for children for their mental health, especially coming out of lockdown, to kind of give them that boost." What? To tell them that they're a published author in year 5? And then for the rest of their life, they expect this is just going to happen like that.
Actually, I have read certain published authors who that must have happened to them in their school days, because that would explain the quality of their literary output.
It's amazing. It tells you so much, but that's a tiny little snippet of the kind of way that the standards have changed.
Issues,
Absolutely. And the final point, what was my final point?
I love that you actually taken. This is the first time we've recorded together.
He does behind the
He's
screen.
got notes. I'm just reading it, and Aaron's got notes.
I've written it on my. I always think that you're making notes, but you're actually just doodling.
You told me I had a dumb phone. You've got like the original smartphone.
Well, that's an old one of those old BlackBerry ones. It doesn't
has
really go
buttons
online.
on it. It's
got the QWERTY keypads are lovely. I need them. I need the QWERTY keypad.
Anyway.
But yeah, the last one was actually an experience we had in terms of the missional thing. So Isabel, our eldest, likes to share the gospel with her friends. We encourage her to do that. She's had a lot of trouble doing that. She's gotten in trouble in terms of sharing her views on various things. At Christmas time, in the Christmas card giving out thing that you do at school, she put Christmas tracts in there, which she wanted to do. I like the 10 of those. Thank you, 10ofthose.com. I ordered a load of their good tracts. And she put some in there. I got a call the next day from the head teacher. We've had an official complaint.
Really?
From one of the parents, unnamed, and turns out I was like, I think I know who that is, and we know them well.
Yeah.
They're humanists. So they didn't tell us they'd made an official complaint. I said, okay, what's the problem? Well, we're not allowed to dispense literature, and we're worried about extremism. I was like, well, hang on. So this is a Christian child giving out a Christian tract about Jesus
and
Jesus' birthday in a Christian Church of England school. What about this is problematic? Oh, it's nothing to do really with the content. The content's fine. So it better be fine, because this is what, presumably, you're actually accountable to the Church of England for this. But they're so worried about that. The Church of England's all over the place anyway. But it was interesting that I said, I want to I don't want to cause you problems. But I want to make a counter complaint so the school governors know that I don't think it's okay. You just to clarify, you want to tell me that I should tell my child in this age of free expression, let them express themselves. You want to tell my child to stop sharing her faith, which is fundamental to what it means to her to be a Christian. Yes. Oh, but just the problem is, it's just the literature. It's like, okay, she gets flack day in, day out in the playground for what she believes. Crazy for not believing that the world just came out of nothing. That she constantly gets that, but she puts her response to it, just a general Christian tract in a Christmas card. It's not okay. We then got accosted, both Molly and I, separately by these two parents who didn't tell us they made the complaint, but kind of it was clear, shouting at us shouting at her in the street when she has the children walking along. I then think, well, I need to sort this out. I need to talk to the husband. I tried to catch him at the school gate, and we go in, and there's the social distancing for the kind of hand washing. Yeah. He came behind me in the queue, which was brilliant. I'll wait. He was very socially distanced, I noticed. He was about 20 metres behind me. very, very
theologically distanced.
Yeah. And so I was like, I wonder why he's supposed to. So I waited outside the other side. He never came out. I was like, I'll catch him another time. We drove to the local shop, parked in the car park, and he happened to come in. I was like, this is brilliant. Here he is again. So I'll wait outside. He took an age to come out of the shop. He eventually came out, and I had a kind of smirk on my face. So I was like, I hear there's a little bit of a misunderstanding between Molly and your wife the other day. And he started laying into me in the car park, shouting at me, "You are despicable. I cannot believe you would propagandize my child through your child." I was like, whoa, well, you've been in our house, you know us, this is quite normal. And this was like a normal middle class kind of person. And then suddenly the whole veneer comes down when you push a button, and they feel like, this shows that we're not really wanting rational discussion over these things. And that kind of thing is all over the place. And this guy, by the way, he wouldn't have the conversation. I said, you're the one who sounds like a religious zealot here. You don't want your child exposed to other ideas. And you don't want to discuss them. You don't even want to discuss them. He drove off. And the funny thing is, he's actually a lecturer in peace and reconciliation studies. Isn't that amazing? Wow.
I think that does happen to one thing that Andy was saying earlier before we recorded the show, which was when we talk about being missional, we can think back to our experiences at school, which for me it's kind of easier than Andy, because I'm slightly younger. But like for all of us, we look back at that and there was the hostility and everything else, but the level of hostility, not just from your peers, but particularly from your teachers and the whole institution now, which wasn't there maybe 10, 20 years ago, that we need to bear in mind. But I mean, we're going to have to wrap up soon. I think what I was going to say before you said your very helpful 3 points off your antique
my BlackBerry
mobile phone from a
museum.
It's
clockwork. It's got this key that he turns.
That's amazing. You don't have to charge it up, do you?
That's it. You just got to wind it.
Wind the key. It gives you that month's battery life.
That's right.
But what we were going to say is that obviously in a way this podcast may sound like it's been kind of an advert for homeschooling, which in a sense, you both have come to that decision. So you'd be surprised if you weren't convinced that that is a good option that you'd want to recommend to others. But I think, again, we were chatting about this earlier, I guess our feeling is not necessarily to say every Christian should homeschool their children, but I think the danger is we just go with the flow and we don't think through. So actually, there are other options. So the missional option is one of them. And actually, I look back at my time, I went to a pretty bog standard comprehensive school. I certainly could have probably got a better education, perhaps if I'd been taught at home, both my parents are teachers, or if I'd gone to a better school. But actually, I look back and I think there were great opportunities. We ran a Christian union. We had 50, 60, 70 non-Christians coming to Guerrilla Christian events. But actually what was really important for me is that I was massively supported, particularly by the local church through our youth group. I had youth leaders who would let us come every week with kind of the things that had come up at school. We could chat them through. We were equipped to do that. And so it wasn't this assumption you're going to this neutral environment. There is no neutral environment. There's no kind of neutral place. And that's, again, one of the arguments against homeschooling. It's like, you're basically proselytizing your kids whilst at school. They're getting this complete secular neutrality. It's like, right. Or what some Christians are doing, which is saying, okay, well, we want to start new schools that are going to be started on an ethos that is going to actually allow people to get a better education. And obviously that's not something that every person is going to be able to do, but what some people are doing very successfully is saying, actually, let's start better schools. And interestingly, you get massive ideological pushback from humanists and others. But the interesting thing is they can't argue often against the reality, which is there are kids doing better at school and getting better educations as a result.
Well, you see, what intrigues me on that story that Aaron shared, I mean, the school in which this happened is a Church of England school. So I find it fascinating that your humanist friends have chosen to send their kids to a Church of England school, presumably because they see something that's attractive. I mean, I think, we are running rapidly out of time, but, Aaron had his 3 points. I've got my 17 points. No, just a couple of things I'd want to say as we bring this towards an end. Like, I think there's a huge role for the church here, because I think it's interesting to look historically, ironically, the church, the sort of mass school movement here began in this country through the involvement of Christians. People like, you have Wilberforce involved in that, you had Shaftesbury and many others who saw education as a public good. And then the church has, as so often happens, has sort of disengaged from the project they started and let people run with it, and it's gone miles from its origin. So I think maybe we're at a time again where there's a huge opportunity for the church. And what I would love to see, and I know there are many pastors listening to the show, and look, I know it's tough being a pastor. There's so much on and it's so busy. But look, one thing I would love to see more churches do is wade into this and go, okay, how do we really actively support the parents? How do we, maybe there's a role for churches to, if you've got young families to go, we're actually going to present the different options to you. We're going to talk about them as a church community. For those who want to homeschool, we're going to give that as a real option. And if you choose to homeschool, we'll help you. We'll get you networked together. We'll offer the church hall as a space to do homeschool activities. If you're going to go the route of, sending your kid into the state system, not particularly missionally, but we're going to send them in there and realize they need support. We're going to teach you as a parent how to teach your child. We're going to do the apologetics. We're going to put lots of structure in there. So little Johnny or little Jane is really equipped. And for those of you who want to go the full-blown missional route, again, we're going to equip you and support you. I'd love to see more churches have, prayer meetings for their local school to be really engaged, encouraging church members to be on the board of government. There's so many ways. I think the church as a whole, there are exceptions, but as a whole, is unengaged. And you mentioned starting new schools. Just to plant a seed, because if just like one person listening to this did this, I got a friend of mine who's a pastor in Scotland. Before he came to Scotland, was a pastor of a church down south in I think it was London. And some years ago now, that the church had a vision to do just that. They had a vision to start a small school. They wanted to start a fee-paying school to make it work. They wanted to set the fees astronomically low, so they got their costs covered, but it was accessible. And they said their vision was they wanted a school where all the teaching staff were Christian. The ethos was unapologetically Christian, but they sort of, as they prayed about it and worked the vision out, they figured they could afford to have they just have 30-35% of the kids Christian, and the goal was to have the other 65% non-Christian. So flip it round. Rather than Christians going to the state school system, let's get the secular folks going on. And they said, actually, what was amazing, the school was a huge success. It's still going, huge popularity locally because they did a first-class education. And they weren't banging people over the heads with the Bible every day, but they were unapologetically Christian. Parents signed a kind of covenant to say that you recognize this is a Christian school. And they said what was amazing was the approval ratings from the non-Christians who chose that school, because they knew there would be none of the woke nonsense, a first-class education, and Christian stuff. But, I think more churches could do that, actually.
I just a point off the bum, a point with 3 sub-points, which was my way of saying 3 more points, but I'll try and make them brief. But just to really help Andy, and I'll get into that. And Michael, I want to put a little thing in, because I think that people listening, your experience, when you say when you grew up in school, I think we were all trained not in homeschool, right? You could argue educationally we haven't turned out terribly. But
speak for yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Or in our faith, And people say, well, there's loads of stories people went through school. What's such a big deal? Now, I think this is the fallacy here, that schooling is qualitatively different to even any of us experience. So Michael back in the 1970s, of course, and the rest of us other times. But we're in a new world, as it were. We're in a completely, not just the woke generation, even before that it was heading that direction. We've got that as the ideologies that are coming in really vigorously at primary level. We've talked about that already. That is ramped up. So you can't just say, if you're a parent, it was okay for me when I was at school and I had some support from my youth group. Firstly, the point Andy makes, churches are not on it as they maybe have been at other points. Secondly, the schools themselves are qualitatively different, and the digital era changes the game. Smartphones change the game. Sexting changes the game. The extent to which people are having screen time, that changes a lot about everything. So it's not the same as when you were younger. It is a different environment. And feeding from that, it is a missional. Homeschooling is a missional act. It's not like I want to take my children away from mission. It's doing mission. You're actually doing mission to your children and training them as missionaries for the world in the way that you can. And one of the ways you can do that you don't get in school, is that you can blend education with character formation. So at school, the teachers haven't got time to care about the heart of your child. Are you okay with them learning everything they need to learn about God's creation in the whole world, without the worldview that this is God's creation, and not thinking about connecting it to their character? So you really just behavioral management and feed you with information, and then talk about mindfulness and online safety. That's often, there's so much stuff they're talking about here, but it's not Christian character formation. So what Molly's able to do now with them, she can spot when our children behave in a certain way, where the root issue of the heart is. Parents can do that. We love our children. We know we spend a lot of time with them. And it'll be the same for you listeners. You know where your children are. You know when a certain thing is said means something else when that person says it. And you can address that issue in the midst of education. Your teachers aren't going to do that. So that's one of the ways for us of why it's such a missional thing, is actually you can bring up in that way.
I want to say just two last things, and then it's for Pastor Michael to wrap it up. But also, I'm also conscious of ending this. We always like to end shows positively, and I'm just conscious one of the points I'm going to make is a sort of negative one. We'll do the negative one and the positive one, then Pastor Michael Landers as the happy evangelist. The negative one is that you're absolutely right. I think even if you're listening to this and you're in your 30s, with a parent or whatever, or thinking about becoming a parent, you're absolutely right. The school system is now not the school system you grew up in. But even for those of us who look back, there's a tendency we look back through rosy-coloured spectacles. Yeah. I look back, I went to school, I turned 49 in a few weeks. I went to school in the 1980s. You might think that was a rosy-coloured period. Well, I have vast amounts of my Christian peers that I was at school with are not following Christ today. Yeah. I set up a Christian union at the secondary school I was in with 2 friends. Neither of those friends, as far as I know, are following Christ. Now, I'm not wholly blaming the school system, but it wasn't this wonderful rosy utopia. It was tough then. And I think the danger is that I think what happens is, as you move on from school and you lose contact with people, you forget. Interesting question to ask yourself. If you were at school as a Christian, in the 80s and 90s, how many of your Christian friends then are still following Christ? Yeah. And would it have been different if the choices the parents made were different? I don't know. But then lastly, the positive point, and then Michael, is look, we've talked a bit about the fear of unengaging and stuff. That's often what's thrown at homeschoolers. But you can unengage, you can withdraw to hide. You can also withdraw to engage. What are you withdrawing for? So if you're a sports person and you're part of a team and your team is preparing for some big challenge, there'll be times when you withdraw. You huddle together, you get the team ready to go out and fight the big battle. If you're in the army, the first thing they do as a new recruit is they don't send you out in the battlefield. You have a time of doing your training when you've withdrawn from the field of combat to get ready. And as Christians, we can withdraw to hide. We can withdraw to get right. Let's get our kids ready. So boy, when we launch them on the world, age 17 or 18, they are ready to go. They know how to engage. They're non-Christian friends. They have non-Christian friends. They're really thought through in the scriptures and worldview and character formation. And look, things still go wrong. Ultimately, the human heart is a complex thing. And to go, ultimately, people don't become Christians because of good parenting. They do it because of the Spirit of God working in them. But I think we can we can set our kids up far better than we have been doing. Yeah. So as long as you're withdrawing for a purpose and not just to stick your head under a haystack, I don't think it's a problem.
It's great.
That's all really helpful. It's something I probably should have mentioned earlier. If you think that it's only Christians that are asking these questions, that's also another challenge. So it's interesting. Someone that I've enjoyed listening to, Catherine Birbal sing.
Oh, yes.
And
Michaela School.
The Michaela School in London. Not a Christian, but actually saying there's a fundamental problem with the way that kids are being educated in our country. Yeah. And for her, that has meant actually becoming the head teacher of a school that is run on a very different ethos. Yeah. In many ways, although it's not explicitly publicly said to be Christian, an ethos which is grounded in Christian thoughts that's influenced our world. But interestingly, it's not just Christians saying there's a problem here. There's a lot of people who are actually starting to say, are we really educating our children? Are we indoctrinating them and so on? And I think as I mentioned a minute before, we're not simply saying you must homeschool your kids, but we are saying, let's think about this. Let's not assume that the education system in our country is perfectly neutral and safe. And let's think about how we can respond to that. That may be that you choose to homeschool. It may be that you think more intentionally about how you support your children through school as a church. If you're a pastor, how you think about that. I often think it's amazing that we think that a 5-minute epilogue in the middle of a party, effectively, for some youth works, is going to counteract the indoctrination of a week being at school. It takes time to actually help people think these things through. We need to really invest in our young people. It may be that you start a new school, all sorts of options open, but actually we want to think about that. And as we've said, hopefully think about that positively. How can we therefore make a difference? This isn't to just, help our children survive, but how can we help our children grow up so they can make a difference in our world for good, ultimately, with the gospel as a foundation. Absolutely. Well, this has been really fascinating. I have learnt lots as well, as always. We hope that you have too. I hope that this has been stimulating, thought-provoking. Do let us know what you think, as always. We'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, suggestions. If you enjoy the show, then give us a like, a subscribe, or a review. If you'd like to support us, so that we can have biscuits next time we meet in person. I
gave you pastries this morning.
Actually, yes, you did, and they weren't even claimed on Part of the Gap's expenses, were they?
Well,
exactly.
Not yet.
But one day we may get a Danish pastry on the support of individuals. But that'd be great, and you can get in touch that way. But until next time, thank you so much for joining us. We've been Aaron, Andy, and Michael, and this has been Part of the Gaps.